you put your body there. Sometimes you put your body there. When you're called by something higher than yourself, you put your body there. You march, you picket, you chain yourself to the White House fence. You stand in solidarity. You sit across from a legislator and look that person in the eye as you tell your story. You show up. You put your body there. I've put my body there, and I know many of you have too. I've put my body there over and over again as I was called on behalf of justice, on behalf of women, reproductive freedom, the environment, immigrants, Native Americans, gays, transgender folks, African Americans, protests against unjust wars, and other causes rooted in justice. You put your body there. For when words and persuasions go only so far, you put your body there. As you embody your convictions, you gain power, especially when your body marches alongside thousands of others who share your conviction that justice and love shall prevail in this world. Your body makes a difference. And sometimes it's the only thing you can bring to the party. Your body. And so it was 50 years ago in Selma, Alabama. Thousands were called to march from Selma to Montgomery to demand voting rights, a very basic American freedom. The African American citizens of Alabama and civil rights organizers put the only thing they could out there, their bodies. And when the first marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were brutally attacked by state and local police. Reverend Martin Luther King called upon the clergy of the nation in the wake of that awful attack to call upon the clergy to join in the struggle, to put their bodies there in Alabama alongside the bodies of the African American community. And some of those who dropped everything in their lives and traveled immediately to Selma were 179 Unitarian Universalist ministers and seminarians, and some other dedicated lay people like Viola Liuzzo, a Detroit housewife who was deeply inspired by her faith to make the trip. This weekend, thousands gathered in Selma to commemorate the courageous action of people putting their bodies on the line for freedom and justice. A lot of them were our fellow Unitarian Universalists who heard some very stirring speeches from a variety of people. Did any of you get a chance to listen to any of the live streamed events from Selma? A few of you? Yeah. What'd you think? Awesome? Awesome? Yes. Yes. I was able to catch just a bit of the action, but I was struck by what Reverend Mark Morrison Reed shared with the crowd. Now, Mark Morrison Reed is an African American Unitarian Universalist minister who was raised in our faith and has grew up to be a chronicler of the Black experience within Unitarian Universalism. His latest book was The Selma Awakening, a story about UU involvement in Selma and how it changed us. Now, I've known Mark for years. I've had that deep pleasure. And so I really wanted to hear his remarks in particular. And his message was surprisingly simple. He asked, what compelled all those ministers to answer Dr. King's call? Yes, they cared about civil rights. that's for sure. And they were justifiably horrified at what they saw on television in particular, as people were beaten as they crossed that bridge. But let's be honest, the civil rights movement had been happening for a while, so violence against blacks and whites promoting civil rights was nothing really new. But what was deeply compelling at that moment was relationship. Relationship. You see, Dr. King knew a lot of these Unitarian Universalists because they were together at Boston Theological Seminary. They had traveled in circles together. One of the leaders, Reverend Homer Jack, had traveled to Ghana with Dr. King. Many of the other Unitarian Universalist ministers had forged close relationships with African American civil rights leaders. They didn't know each other casually, just to say, oh, hi, Joe. No, these were long and meaningful relationships, friendships. So when King put out that call, one of the first telegrams he sent was to Reverend Dana Greeley, who was the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association in Boston. Greeley immediately sent out telegrams and made phone calls to clergy across the country, not only Unitarian Universalists, but people leaders in other faiths. The clergy receiving those calls knew they had to go. They had to put their bodies there. And in some cases, congregational boards heard the news about King's clergy call. They called emergency board meetings. And when their minister arrived at the meeting, they handed their minister the tickets, the plane or train tickets, to go to Alabama. It was relationships with African American communities that also made the difference. Reverend James Reeb lived in Roxbury, Massachusetts, a predominantly black area near Boston. He was working with people on fair housing and good housing for their community. That was his ministry. His ministry was totally bound up with the fate of the African American community. Many other white Unitarian Universalist ministers were members of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. You might be interested to know that some of the original founders of the NAACP were white Unitarian Universalists, standing in solidarity. So again, these people did not have casual relationships, but meaningful ones. And so Morrison Reed recounted the stories of a call so compelling that you would leave, and these were, it was in the 60s, this is 50 years ago, so it was male clergy. You would leave your wife and your children and your congregation at a moment's notice, like Reverend Wells did in Virginia, as Cynthia told us. And importantly, Morrison Reed asked the crowd there in Selma a couple of days ago, with whom are you in relationship? What relationships might just transform your life? For it is not the cautious, rational, analytical understanding of oppression that gets us up and out of our comfort zone to do what needs to be done. No. It's relationship. It's really knowing people, really knowing their stories, really caring about them, feeling it deep in your bones so that when you get that call, you know you're going to cross that bridge with them. And so here was Mark's other question that he posed to the crowd. What's getting in the way of you making those meaningful, transformational relationships in your life? It does take courage to step out. The unknown is scary. You might feel frightened. or intimidated to step into a world that isn't quite your own, uncertain of the rules, uncertain of yourself. You might feel doubts coming up. You might have the urge to flee. But as Morrison Reeb noted, being careful and cautious is not a recipe for change and transformation. And so, as I was listening to him, live streaming from Selma, I was thinking to myself, what of us here in Ogden right now? What now are we called to do here as Unitarian Universalists? With whom are we in relationship? What relationships might transform our lives? What's holding us back from forming those deep, meaningful relationships with others in our community who might just need our allyship in their struggles for justice? I ask these questions of each of us individually to ponder. I think these are good questions, but also as a challenge to the congregation. For many years, you forged deep and meaningful relationships with the LGBTQ community here in Ogden and greater Utah. And of course, outreach resource centers was the fruit of those relationships. As we look forward into the future, we'll be exploring how this community wants to bring more love, justice, and mercy into the world. And so we need to be asking ourselves those questions about relationship. With whom are we in relationship? What is holding us back from getting to know our neighbors right here on this block? Or the ones across town, people of other colors, people who might speak a different language than us, people of different backgrounds, people of other faiths. These are questions for us to ponder together. Questions that we're called to live out as Unitarian Universalists who care about racial justice and who care enough about it to endure feeling anxious and awkward, caring enough to put ourselves out there even though it means we might even be wounded from time to time, as we learn our way to being strong, justice-filled allies. Let us be there for each other in this quest, this loving each other into this place where we're willing to step out of our comfort zone and get to know our neighbors. Now there's a small and powerful step that we can take together, and that's dedicating our offering to support local organizations that address justice and compassion in our community. Your church board has decided to commit to sharing a portion of each Sunday's offering starting in July with an offering that will go to a local, national, or global organization that works for justice or offers compassion. And in the process, we'll all be learning more about these organizations and starting to build relationships, expand our circle. So please stay tuned. You're going to be hearing more details about this, but this is just a little one-step thing that we can do together. It's a tangible step of starting down the path of building those meaningful, transformative relationships that can start to bring real change. And please, let us not be in denial about the depth of racism that still poisons our nation. We have much work to do. Just Friday evening, as folks gathered in Selma, yet another young, unarmed black man was killed by a white cop in Madison, Wisconsin this time. Black lives matter. Brown lives matter. We have our part to do as justice-seeking people. I want to share just a small portion of Dr. King's eulogy for Reverend James Reeb. I'm sharing it because his words could have been spoken yesterday, and they remind us about our collective responsibility for perpetuating oppression, even unwittingly, and our moral imperative to work for justice, to stand on the side of love. Here are King's words from Reeb's funeral. Naturally, we are compelled to ask the question, who killed James Reeb? The answer is simple and rather limited when we think of the who. He was murdered by a few sick, demented, and misguided men who have the strange notion that you express dissent through murder. There is another haunting, poignant, desperate question we are forced to ask this afternoon that I asked a few days ago as we funeralized James Jackson. It is the question, what killed James Reeb? And when we move from the who to the what, the blame is wide and the responsibility grows. James Reeb was murdered by the indifference of every minister who has remained silent behind the safe security of stained glass windows. He was murdered by the irrelevancy of a church that will stand amid social evil and serve as a taillight rather than a headlight, an echo rather than a voice. He was murdered by the irresponsibility of every politician who has moved down the path of demagoguery, who has fed his constituents the stale bread of hatred and the spoiled meat of racism. He was murdered by the brutality of every sheriff and law enforcement agent who practices lawlessness in the name of the law. He was murdered by the timidity of a federal government that can spend millions of dollars a day to keep troops in South Vietnam and yet cannot protect the lives of its own citizens seeking constitutional rights. Yes, he was even murdered by the cowardice of every Negro who tacitly accepts the evil system of segregation, who stands on the sidelines in the midst of a mighty struggle for justice. So in his death, James Reeb says something to each of us, black and white alike. Says that we must substitute courage for caution. Says to us that we must be concerned not merely about who murdered him, but about the system, the way of life, the philosophy that produced the murder. His death says to us that we must work passionately, unrelentingly, to make American dreams a reality so that he did not die in vain. Indeed, those who crossed the bridge and those who died continue to inspire us. May we dedicate ourselves to building those strong, truly loving relationships that can transform us. May we put our bodies there when we're called. May we unrelentingly work for justice in whatever precious time each of us has to offer. May it be so. Blessed be.